So this is the portion of the 68 RFE that really needs the most work. You know, I've talked about things that have to happen in the case that keeps the integrity from flexing in that, but really the heart of the 68 RFE is the hydraulics, and this is really the brain of the 68. So the valve body controls clutch application, clutch release, timing, interaction, receive all the signals from the computer. The computer translates it into the solenoid block assembly. The solenoid block assembly has solenoids in it that controls the valve action of the valve body. And then of course, ultimately the valve body controls oil going to the clutch packs. So the big problem with the 68 RFE is hydraulic cross leaks. In fact, the hydraulic cross leaks are so bad in this transmission that Chrysler decided to put in little pressure switches that indicate cross leaks. They call them basically fail-safes that will indicate a channel that has oil in it when it's not supposed to be. So basically you have 5 clutch packs, which indicates your 5 accumulator pistons. These accumulator pistons accumulate fluid as it goes to the clutch pack to kind of soften the clutch apply, and there's a pressure switch in it, and if the pressure switch gets energized or compressed with any more than about 6 psi oil pressure, then the computer knows that there's an internal cross leak fault and it fail-safes the tranny. It's pretty amazing that the integrity of the transmission was built wimpy enough that they actually have monitors in them, but being the case, you know, that's something we actually utilize for self-diagnosis and to work through it. So there's kind of like an early valve body and a late valve body in the 68 RFE. You'll see the casting differences here. You'll see kind of the dark anodized casting, which you see in the main valve body. And then the earlier valve bodies have more of just a basic aluminum. This has been machined, you know, from Chrysler obviously, originally. And what you'll see is the aluminum difference. So Chrysler put an anodization on it to basically make them harder. And it kind of helped. You know, you'll see in some cases where, you know, the valves actually wear a little bit slower, but still you're talking, you know, that 80 or 90,000 miles, you still see wear. As you see in this one, you'll see a lot of wear in the valve body where the accumulators actually ride, and the same thing where the valves ride in the bores. So, you know, Chrysler did a little bit with that, but we really need to take it another step and take this casting and redesign it and get the pistons in it that it needs. So this is an example of some cross leaking that you'll see. This is your factory separator plate, and this is these typically we found the channel plates will warp by as much as about 14 thousandths, and the valve body will warp as much as about 5 thousandths. So if you kind of take a look at one of these, you'll see the clearance in them where it actually gets kind of tight at the end, but it's loose here. That basically is an indication that this is concaved. So the valve body goes together with the main valve body assembly, and then there is a separator plate that fits between them, which is this portion of it. So the separator plate goes between the valve body and then it goes to the channel plate, and oil has to pass through these holes from the channel casting. And the idea is that when a clutch pack is engaged, it goes from the solenoid pack through the shift valve into the accumulator, through the separator plate into the channel plate, that all of these worm tracks, there's never any leakage. Well, and the reality of it is there's a lot of leakage because they warp. And the biggest thing that happens, aluminum, it essentially over time it seasons. And like any metal, as it gets relaxed, it finds its you know, real nature at home. So we found that having seasoned materials such as the valve body casting and the channel plate, that having this and machining it, we machine them instead of trying to do, you know, like a gasket. Some companies have come out with aftermarket gaskets that you can kind of put between them and clamp it between it. Well, you know, it's kind of a Band-Aid. You know, you have your channel casting, then you have your separator plate with a gasket, and then you have another valve body on top of it. If it's warped, it's warped. So when you put the gasket between it, it's a bit of a Band-Aid. Over high time, you know, the gaskets tend to fade and blow out. That's typically why manufacturers don't use them to start with in the valve bodies. So, you know, what I've found over years of building these things is, let's start with a good casting. Let's machine it flat. Take your valve body casting, machine it flat. It's kind of a big operation. It takes literally about an hour per piece to get them all machined. And then we laser cut a separator plate that's about 3 times the thickness. So again, this kind of acts as a brace. It's very strong, it's not flimsy. So you have them extremely tough, and you clamp it between the 2 elements. And once you clamp that between them and they're machined, then you have an absolute flat surface. You have a piece of aluminum that's not going to warp again because it's already seasoned. That means all the molecules have relaxed and they've gotten happy and they've set into a structure that they're not going to move again. So now you have 2 solid pieces to work with a good stiffener plate between them. Then take it a step farther. Now your factory accumulator pistons are pretty wimpy. That's these guys. You know, they're just little cast pieces that, you know, are probably made for 3 cents a piece, I'm guessing. We actually build billet little accumulators that are redesigned, and we take it a step farther. So these Teflon rings that are essentially just a kind of a piece of Teflon that goes into the factory pistons. This is a brand new Teflon ring on a piston that Chrysler uses in a stock valve body that happens to be wore out. And this is your sealing surface that you have oil pressure that goes behind this piston, and this piston basically acts as an accumulator. So it needs to seal up completely 100% like airtight. You know, you oil it up like you put air to it, it should hold air. Well, this is what we get. That's how much sealing surface you get on the factory valve body. So this is what we found. Not only that, if you look at the clearance there, it's terrible. I mean, it's atrocious. How these things actually hold oil pressure to start with is beyond me, but the fact is they don't actually hold pressure that well, and the CVIs that are calculated actually have an offset in them, so they have a controlled leak, so they kind of deal with it. Which you shouldn't have to deal with a controlled leak, you should actually do something that works. So what we've done is we've designed these, so we put an X-Seal O-ring on them, and essentially this X-Seal is a rubber Viton. It's really, they're very expensive, but it's the best thing you can use. It's more the kind of stuff that you'd use in rocket engines. You know, very high heat, designed especially for this bore in a high pressure situation. And then we bore them, and not only do we bore them, but we put a crosshatch on them, just like an engine. You know, we didn't invent this technology, we're just reapplying it to applications where we need it. So we put a nice crosshatch in it. So now when this rubber, when these seals go in, they actually have a sealing surface that will maintain their integrity, and you kind of get an idea of the type of seal surface you're getting, right? Well, what that gives you is not only a perfect sealing piston or accumulator, but it also gives you longevity because you have the crosshatch in these bores, which allows a microfilm of oil as this is wiping up and down. The first land seals, the second one still has oil because there's oils in the grooves. So these grooves maintain oil, which basically means you're going to maintain longevity on your sealing ring. Now, we're all aware of the problems with the overdrive clutch. As I mentioned with the cross leaking that happens on these trannies, one of the areas that we found is the overdrive clutch actually will get oil in some cases when it shouldn't be oiled. So in other words, in first, second, or third gear, the overdrive clutch has to be released. That means no oil can be in that system. Well, the overdrive piston will begin to partially apply at only a few pounds of pressure. In some cases, right before the pressure switch sets, so the computer doesn't know that there's a cross leak, but the overdrives are actually creeping on and they're leaking. So even with all the work that we've done to eliminate cross leaks in the valve body, in some cases, a leaky solenoid, you know, a leaky casting, porosity issues, whatever, will bring that overdrive clutch on when you're driving down the road. So what we've done is we have created an extra leak in the overdrive circuit, and that extra leak basically lives here in the overdrive piston. So you'll notice, unlike the factory accumulator, it has 2 rings. We've actually got 4 rings here. And what these 4 rings do is when this overdrive piston is in its off position, we've created an additional leak that bleeds or vents the overdrive circuit completely. Even if there's a little bit of a cross leak, it vents it back to sump. And then as soon as you turn your overdrives on, then the piston overcomes the spill port and it seals up the hole or the leak, so now you don't have a leak, and then you have full piston travel. So that's been a huge thing for us, because as the line pressures increase and you turn up line pressure however you're doing it, then you are ensured that you're never going to get oil in that overdrive port when you're at heavy throttle in first, second, third. For instance, you're at a stop, you have your trailer on, or a fifth wheel, or 50,000 pounds, whatever it is, and you go to accelerate, line pressure ramps up from the stock 160 up to about 275 PSI. So as we ramp that pressure up, then that added pressure doesn't leak into the overdrive circuit and actually apply the overdrive clutches and burn up the overdrives before you even get into overdrive. So the 68 has a big problem with overdrive clutch integrity, actually in first, second, and third, along with, when it's in fourth or fifth or sixth, applying that overdrive clutch and keeping it clamped. So I kind of talk about the fourth or the overdrive section, especially fifth and sixth problems about the 68 RFE, and we talk about the hard parts. Some of the other things we do in the valve body is we allow for full line pressure. So the factory valve body is limited to 160 PSI line pressure. The 68 has to have well over 200. So we set up the transmission to be capable of up to 275 PSI line pressure based on how you control it, whether it's the co-pilot or an external or an aftermarket program in the TCM itself. Now, some of the other areas that we deal with is the valves inside the valve body. A lot of these valve bodies wear out. We found the anodized valve bodies last a little bit longer, still having issues with them. The metal, the material is essentially the same. A big deal is how these valves actually rock in the valve or in the valve body. So you can't really just bore them out with a hone or a drill with a fixture that's typical in the industry. They have to be perfectly indicated. They have to be bored with a boring bar, kind of like the factory did it, and then use a valve that actually is designed to be in the aluminum so it doesn't wear out, and that's how we've really eliminated all the cross-linking in the valves, along with some small valves. Some nice little kits out there that allow us to take these pieces out, which are little bitty valves that rock around, and you can only imagine these valves rocking around in the bore. They break down the oil film between them because they don't have much concentricity, say like a long valve would. So this is a really innovative idea that we have a little tit on the end of it. So now that valve can't rock, right? It's kind of positioned in, it's solid. So as it moves in and out, it acts as a single valve. So all of these valves act in unison, and they don't walk sideways wearing the oil off the side of the bore, creating all these cross leaks. So there's many valves inside this valve body that utilize that type of technology. So pretty much the entire valve body is reworked. All the bores are rehoned. We're at about 7/10,000 of an inch clearance on these valves, which allows enough of a check that when you put this valve in, you do a vacuum check, that it literally will hold vacuum from land to land, and it doesn't make contact. So you have just enough room there for an oil film, and that's exactly where it should be. Too loose, you have hydraulic issues. Too tight, they stick. So it's got to be perfect. And again, the only way to achieve that is to actually set it up in a mill, in the machining operation, and machine them with a very fine ground boring bar that we essentially build, and then build the valves to it, and then everything's set. So you have all your accumulators, you have your main valves, the surfacing, the thick separator plate, surfacing on the channel plate, redesign of the accumulators, go away from the cast, go to the nice billet pieces, got the high dollar Viton, high temperature O-rings, and seal it all up, and then everything comes together as an assembly. And that really becomes your valve body. So there's a ton of work done inside the valve body, and then of course cap it all over as these pistons go into the bores like so. Then you have your accumulator springs. These accumulator springs have a tendency of beating everything up, so we also give you a thicker accumulator plate that tightens down, tightens everything together so it doesn't beat them all out. I mean, I've had these trannies come in where I've seen these plates are literally warped and hanging outside of the transmission. They hit the side of the tranny case. There's so much hydraulic pressure on these things that's beating on them. So, you really need a piece of metal, thick enough that's hard and that holds that in there so it just maintains it. you know, and all these things are just, they're so important, you know, when it comes to making these transmissions hold a lot of power, and especially warranting them for 5 years like we do. So pretty big deal. Now, that's only part of it. So now we have the valve body. That is the hydraulic portion. You know, like I say, we have the computer that is telling the transmission or the valve body what to do. Then the valve body converts those signals to hydraulic action, and it turns on the clutch packs. Then the clutch packs do their work, which we'll talk about in a second, and then the clutch packs grab the planetaries, and the planetaries transfer the power. So the way the valve body works is we have a solenoid pack, which is full of solenoids. There's 5 solenoids in this pack, 5 pressure switches in this pack. It's all for receiving commands from the TCM and doing its work, and receiving information from the hydraulic integrity of the train and send it back to the TCM. So what we've had to do additionally is we add our little controller, which is our co-pilot. And the co-pilot does a few things. The co-pilot, one, controls line pressure of the transmission, which is the clamping force. So with the addition, when we modify our valve body and you add the co-pilot module, which lives inside your dash, the co-pilot gives or controls the transmission. It tells the TCM, the transmission control module, that it's happy, that it needs to have the information because we highly modify the transmission. It tells the TCM that he's getting what he's asked for, and then we control the transmission via the co-pilot, and it plugs into the valve body. So now this is the TCM, this is the transmission control module that comes from the engine over the transmission to here. He goes to the co-pilot, and then we send these signals, and it literally simply just plugs right onto the valve body. And as it plugs in the valve body, then it's a nice plug-and-play operation. And what we do with this is this little guy not only gives the driver some adjustability and drivability control, essentially keeps it in the gear you want it to be in. So as engine torque increases, then we can force the lockup and increase line pressure to clamp the clutches down. We'll increase line pressure instead of limiting it to 160 pounds of line pressure that clamps these clutches together. We allow the line pressure to increase up to about 270 pounds of line pressure to clamp the clutches at high engine load. So in other words, you're at a stoplight, you accelerate, you take off from the line, and engine torque comes up and it's trying to slip these clutches and break them, and line pressure stops at 160. It's not quite enough to hold them. We're actually looking at that engine load, and we will increase the line pressure over stock up to 270 PSI to really clamp those clutches so you can make a shift from first to second to third, third to fourth, fourth to fifth, controlling lockup while under power, and the engine doesn't derate. So what Chrysler's done, Chrysler has been very effective at making the 68RFE live behind very stock applications because it has so much derate built in. So the computer, the transmission control module is talking to the engine control module, and the transmission control module is monitoring the input speed and the output speed of the transmission and the pressure switches and the solenoid and everything that's going on in the tranny. And as soon as you push the transmission too far, then the transmission begins to slip a little bit, and then the factory tranny turns down power. It tells the engine, hey guy, you need to turn down, so the engine derates. And then the transmission makes it shift, and then it slowly allows power to come back up. So you buy your vehicle, say it's rated at 600 foot-pounds of torque at the rear wheels. The reality of it is you're probably only using 350 or 400 foot-pounds of that torque because the engine begins to sense some slip, and it derates the engine, kind of lets the tranny do its deal, and then you go about your way. So the more weight you put on it, the hotter the engine gets, the less power you actually have to use. So what we've done by modifying the valve body and adding the co-pilot allows the TCM to be happy, and he doesn't understand or realize, or he's not aware that the transmission may potentially have problems, that we've modified it, and then we control the transmission based on how it should be working for a performance transmission, which means that we tie clamping force of the transmission or line pressure directly to engine load. It's not just the pressure box where we kind of raise pressure based on what he's commanding. This is the only module on the market that actually is a full transmission controller that separates the TCM from the transmission. And we pass some of these signals through, so all the shift timing is controlled by the TCM, but actual line pressure is controlled exclusively based on engine load and torque converter clutch application is controlled basically on engine load, which means that you get a good driving experience. It turns the torque converter clutch on under power instead of forcing the torque converter clutch off, which kills drivability and kills performance. And most importantly, it keeps the tranny alive, so you don't have to worry about the thing derating and essentially burning up. So co-pilot's a really big deal. We have a tow version of this and we have a race version of this. So, you know, the tow version is perfectly adequate for most all applications. If you want to go to the racetrack and, you know, really put your foot into it, and, you know, if you're making 800-900 horsepower, you know, and you choose the 68 to do work, then you certainly want the race box because it gives you full torque converter clutch control, forced application, has some other like hidden elements in there that work really well, but for the most part, the tow application, co-pilot is really what you're after. Does a phenomenal job. You really have to use it with our valve body. If not, it does come with a separator plate. You have to put this separator plate into your stock valve body if you were to use the co-pilot, but based on everything I showed you, you'd be a fool if you didn't just do the complete valve body, because there is a ton of work here. And for the amount of work that's in it, the value is phenomenal. So that's kind of a basic overview of what you get with our 68 RFE valve body. Now I'll tell you about some of the internal modifications to the clutch packs, the pumps, and the hard parts.